the first thing we have to do is to plot what our strategy is going to be. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at a photo or I'm looking at this building literally from across the road. Now, because I'm drawing freehand directly in ink, I don't want to be roughing out large boxy shapes that I then refine. And while this is a great way to develop a drawing, if we have a pencil underlining that we erase, I want to develop the freedom and the confidence to draw directly in ink. And that doesn't let me then have the option of erasing any of the drafting outlines that end up not being in the right place. So I need a different system. This is the one which appeared as I worked through the problems that wanting to draw in this way presented. The first thing I do is have a good look at the scene and work out what are the easiest shapes to draw accurately. And this changes for every subject and for every view. In this case, it's going to be this shape down the front. But sometimes it's something on the second floor of a building. Sometimes it's something in the center. Sometimes it's something on one edge. Wherever I have the best chance to capture the proportions, that's where I'm going to start, because that section will then become like my ruler. It will become the section that I use to measure other parts that I draw. And that's why I need to choose the spot that gives me the best chance of capturing the right proportions most easily, because if I don't get it right, it's like having a ruler where the divisions aren't all equally spaced. It's going to be very hard to measure from that later. So I'm going to draw the front of the veranda, and because it finishes right on the gutter, that lets me get a reasonably straight line down here. Particularly with any architecture, it's important to work out where eye level is, approximately at least. I can see that this line slopes down slightly and this line slopes up slightly, so it's going to be between the two of them. And apologies, because the gutter actually doesn't look like it slopes up at this point, because I've managed to tilt my photo downwards. But trust me, when we're looking at it straight on, it does go upwards. And therefore, this line will angle slightly more than this, and this one slightly more again. This line here is below eye level, therefore it's going to be slightly angling up, as is the gutter. I'm going to start by drawing this and coming across and then defining this section here, and then define each of these next two spaces, being aware that with foreshortening, as they come closer towards us, they're going to appear to get wider as well as higher. Once I get, if you like, this 3-box grid in place, I can then use it to position these lines reasonably accurately. Once I've got this done and some of these details, that gives me plenty then to reference from for the rest of the drawing. So let's start. Now I get to put into practice what I've just said. So I start by drawing this, if you like, 3-box grid across the front. And I want to make sure that I get these slight angles started in the right way. In many ways, slight angles are actually harder to draw, I find, than greater ones. And so I want to make sure that I get that angling up, particularly as the line moves across, that I don't bring it back down to something that's more horizontal. It can be very easy to default to horizontal if we're not careful. And now I'm trying to make sure that I increase the width slightly as I go across. Now, while I was planning to draw this same size, I realized after I do the first, if you like, box, that I've drawn it larger than my photo. Therefore, I'm going to finish up with a drawing that's larger than my reference, which is why it will end up going right to the very edge of the paper. However, changing the size changes nothing about keeping the proportions correct. In fact, if we know how to keep proportions correct, we can start with very small references and finish up with a nice large drawing that looks right. Or we can do it the other way as well. We can reduce the size of our drawing from the reference, because keeping the proportions correct means that all the relative heights and widths stay in the right ratio, in the same ratio to each other. The angles, of course, stay the same regardless of the size we're drawing. So I've got the box, And now I've worked at the top of the veranda to get the roof. Now, what I've tried to do is to measure the height, if you like, from that upper white beam to where the roof changes direction. I'm still not sure whether I've made it just a millimetre too high, which doesn't sound much, but on a relatively small size drawing, a relatively small width, a millimetre can visually change the proportions. So we do want to work hard to be fussy at this point. Now I'm working on the detail of the actual building. So you'll see that I've positioned a series of marks to indicate the base of the front wall where it hits the roadway or the footpath. Notice I haven't drawn a straight line there because straight lines are usually a very poor way to represent the visual effect of the building touching the ground. It's not usually a nice, crisp, sharp edge in the way that often the corner of a building may be, for all sorts of reasons. The ground may not be level, rubbish may have blown up little bits of sticks and stones and things. There might be weeds or tufts of grass that are coming up between the base of the wall and the concrete. And all of this create a disruption to seeing a straight line. And if that's part of the effect of this particular building, we want to capture it as well. It can also give us a bit of flexibility in shifting that line if our first go is not quite in the right place, as happened to me here. You'll notice that that line branches into two. Well, it's actually the lower line that I'm going to use. So what I'm really doing here is I'm looking at the spaces between the veranda posts, and I'm using them to position each window, the shutters, and the doorway. And so this is where now using some of the shapes that we've drawn in proportion accurately starts to really advantage us, because I can now, if you like, do the infill detail inside my shapes, confident that as long as I now get the detail proportion correct, that it will all fit in proportion in the space. One of the difficulties of roughing out large shapes too quickly drawing freehand in ink is that we don't get the proportions correct, and then when we go to put the number of windows or columns or other architectural detail into the spaces or onto the walls, we have trouble fitting the correct number of windows in the space that we have and keeping their proportions looking the same. We end up having to make them thinner or not as tall, squatter, because our overall proportions aren't correct. Does anyone know this feeling, this frustration? However, the fact that I've been able now to get the windows and the doorway in is a big help. And now I align the parts of the building I'm yet to draw with what I have drawn already. And that's how I position this top bit. And I've drawn that straight line down from the top of the roof, again, to show how I try and visualize the height in relation to what I've already drawn. It can be very, I think, visually misleading to follow along diagonal lines. I try and, at this point, disregard the three-dimensional form and just see two-dimensional shape as an easier way to work out where things are in relation to each other. And notice before I draw the verticals for this second chimney, I align it with the first chimney. Now, you're watching me draw this at double normal speed. I'm drawing this with a 0.2mm Copic multi-liner pen. If you want to watch me draw this at actual speed, use the cog icon to slow it down to half speed. And hey, if you're at this point, if you haven't hit the like button, please hit it for me. Leave a comment. Do you draw freehand in ink? Is it something you aspire to do if you don't? Or is it something you'd like to do but feel like it's too hard? If you have any struggles with perfectionism, if you find you end up erasing more lines than you leave in pencil outlines or pencil drawings, switching to directly in ink is a great way to kill that perfectionism. It certainly worked for me. It was one of the reasons I switched to it. I found as my drawing improved, my fussiness improved, and it was starting to become not enjoyable. because the pressure of making mistakes was too great. By removing the chance of getting mistakes, in inverted commas, off the paper, I found I robbed perfectionism of the oxygen it needed to breathe to survive. And that really freed me then to just see every mark as part of the ongoing development of my drawing. But it also taught me, or forced me to learn how I could make marks that, if you like, kept all my options open as long as possible so that I could change them. Now, I'm now doing the effect of the corrugated iron roofing. Corrugated iron is a very, very common Australian building material, still being put on new houses today as much as any other type of roof covering. But when it's old, as in this old house, it gets this wonderful rusted patina. Notice that these lines, though, as they angle to the left, the angle increases because they are affected by perspective. It's also important to work out the angle. What I'm trying to do is to emphasize the shadows that is formed where the corrugations come up against each other, either where the angle of the roof changes, the pitch of the roof changes, or where rows of sheeting joins. Now, because these are horizontal lines across the front of the building, they are affected by perspective as well. So we need to work them into whatever perspective angles we've already established. You're watching this part now where I'm doing the roofing effect and where I'm doing the hatching for the shade and the shadow, now half as fast again. So this is, I think that means triple time. But again, you can slow it down if you want to watch me do it at a slower rate. So this is a bit of a tedious part. This drawing took me 22 minutes to draw in real time, but probably almost half of that, certainly more than a third of that time, was spent doing all this hatching. The most important thing, I think, with the hatching is to try and get some of the relative values in my drawing. So I want the windows to look significantly darker because they do in the photo. One thing I didn't manage to do, was if you look at my reference, across the front of the building, where there's shadow being cast by the veranda awning, it's actually a darker value than that side wall, which is in shade. And I've actually flipped that. And the difference between shade and shadow is shade is simply where the light can't reach part of an object because of the angle from the light source. But shadow is actually cast by another object. And so shadow is darker than shade. And even though the front of the building's white, which is a lighter colour than the brickwork on the side, we can see that it does actually look darker. And if we look at the shadow being cast on the footpath, darker again. So now I'm just adjusting some of the relative values. But what I did want was to capture a sense of the old, weathered, battered nature of this old verandahed house. And I think I've done that. I hope you give it a go. You'll find the reference on my channel community page. So why not print off a hard copy and have a go? Last few lines, what do you think? Do you think I've managed to keep the proportions correct? Why not give it a go yourself? It's a nice, relatively simple building to try and do this. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Why not have a go drawing this? It's a great starter to experiment with drawing freehand directly in ink, but it's also a great subject for experimenting with different effects, different weathered effects of architecture. So why not? But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.